Welcome, everyone, to our latest episode of the Don Quixote project on the Language Learners Club. Today, we're covering the iconic eighth chapter of part one of Don Quixote, in which we have Don Quixote face off against the famous windmills. Tudor, would you like to maybe recap for us what happens in this chapter? Give us a brief synopsis.
So basically, in this chapter, it starts right off the bat. So they set out early in the morning, Sancho and Don Quixote, and then they set out and they see these windmills that are busy turning. But Don Quixote doesn't see windmills; he sees giants, and he decides he's going to attack and destroy these beasts because it's the adventure that they've set out to do. But Sancho says, no, they're windmills. But Don Quixote is not listening. He's just set on destroying them. So he goes, and as he approaches them, the wind begins to turn, and his lance gets stuck in the windmill, and then he gets knocked out, and his lance breaks, right? And now Sancho runs to his aid, and then they speak a bit about um, what, like, how, if he's okay, and like what they need to do. So Don Quixote just says that these giants have been transformed into windmills by the wizard, the magician, who made the library disappear in the previous chapter. And afterwards, then they set out and they're hungry, but well, Sancho is hungry, so he begins to eat. Don Quixote says he's a knight, he doesn't eat. And they also discuss things about fighting. Um, so Don Quixote was speaking about this notion that Sancho mustn't get involved ever if there's a fight. So he must just leave Don Quixote to fight out the battle if it's between knights. He can only get involved if it's something else. And it's interesting then because Sancho was also saying like, oh no, he doesn't want to get involved, you know. And they're
Yeah.
also speaking a bit about this idea of being hurt. And Don Quixote was saying like a knight, he can't say when he's hurt. And I think it's there Sancho speaks about, oh, he will speak when he's hurt about anything. So anyways, they go into the forest. Don Quixote finds a lance because he was retelling a story of another knight who found a who lost his sword and found some like branch. So Don Quixote said his lance is broken. He's going to copy that knight, and he now has a lance. Then they stay the night, sort of. I think they slept. Sancho had eaten so on, and then had been drinking a lot and had to be waken up by Don Quixote. Then they make their way because Don Quixote said there's a specific area, I'm not sure the name, that they'll have an adventure there. And as they set out and arrive there, Don Quixote sees, well, firstly, what we see is two friars, so two priests in the front, and then a carriage with a lady who we understand is on her way to see her husband, and she has some squires serving her. But Don Quixote, what he sees is some magicians who have kidnapped the princess, and now he needs to free her. So basically, he attacks the magicians, which are just friars, so they immediately leave and run away. Sancho Panza doesn't get involved in the fighting, but he goes actually to the magicians, to the friar, to get his spoils of war. But then the people nearby, the squires of the lady, stop him and help the friar be on his way. And then Don Quixote attacks one of the people in front of the who's like in front with the carriage, and basically then it's interesting because then Don Quixote is threatening him. That guy is threatening as well, I think he's from like a specific region in like Basque region. I forgot the name, but it's like a Basque region in Spain. And he basically then like they communicate, but they're antagonizing one another. And then we get left on the hook because they say there's no continuation of what was happened, and we don't know what's going on. So now there's another author who had to search for these recounts to see what would happen, and it will be told later on. That's the chapter in a nutshell, I would
That
say.
is, thank you very much. Very detailed. So you've really covered all the bases and you've brought up like a number of things that we could discuss here that I think are particularly interesting. Obviously, this is the chapter where we see the most iconic moment in all of Don Quixote. If you are looking for two images that sum up Don Quixote and are presented as summing up Don Quixote the most often, it's either just the single scene of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza walking together, or it's the scene of Don Quixote attacking the windmills. And then it's interesting that, of course, the subsequent chapter is the chapter that addresses one of the most interesting problems or one of the most interesting parts of Don Quixote, which is the kind of the diegetic structure. Who's telling us this story, right? Um, and of course, is it a novel or is it history? Um, uh, Not that Cervantes would have thought of novels at the time, because at the time a novela was really like what we would call a novella, something pretty like a very short story, usually in prose, as is Don Quixote, but it's not short. Yes, so maybe what I'll start off with is I'd like to look at this interesting thing about Don Quixote speaking about waging war against these moles. And this is an instance I noticed this time of how Cervantes is actually pretty good at foreshadowing the themes of each chapter in the opening segments and encapsulating and revisiting those themes throughout the chapter. He's probably done this before in other chapters. It's just that I didn't notice because if you look carefully here, Don Quixote says in the okay. So he actually says almost in the first thing he says here is this long phrase where he talks about, um, he talks about how he sees these giants and he says, que esta es buena guerra. This is good war, or it's best translated as this is a just war. And of course, in the doctrine of the times, theologians and moral philosophers would make this distinction between just and unjust wars, as actually we still do, although maybe our criteria have shifted somewhat today. Uh, but of course, one of the features of the medieval and early modern just war is that if you were in the situation where you had to wage war against someone, firstly, it ought to be some kind of defensive war for it to be a just war in some sense. And then, but you were also obliged to use the most brutal means that you can to finish the war as quickly as you can. And then, secondly, the convention, and I'm not sure what the scholastics or the moral philosophers would have actually said about this, but certainly the practical convention was that you were entitled to the booty from that war. And what do we see Sancho doing right after he's learned from Don Quixote? At the very end, he tries to sack the one friar, right?
Yeah.
And deprive the friar of his belongings. So there's this interesting thing where Sancho is learning very, very quickly the he's learning very quickly kind of the rules of this kind of fake made up chivalry that Don Quixote has reconstructed from his texts.
Mm.
Another example later, and I only noticed this now when you mentioned it, is that he doesn't fight in the second part with the Basque and the friars. Sancho waits behind and then goes in to collect the booty afterwards. So he
Mm.
obeys that whole
Mm.
that mandate that Don Quixote had set before him. And then finally, before I hand it over to you, the other interesting thing is I like, as you say, this chapter begins very much in medias res. Like we're just dropped straight into Don Quixote immediately sees the windmills. There's not this sort of prelude that you would expect. As someone who's been exposed to how iconic this part is, we're kind of dropped straight into it.
Mm.
It's a little bit like the end. I don't know if you've read the Divine Comedy, but the end of the Inferno, the final canto, is a lot of people feel it like it's an anticlimax because Dante sees the devil and it's not a particularly dramatic moment relative to everything else that he's experienced to that point. But yeah, I hand over to you for your thoughts here.
I think what's interesting is that because it dropped in, I had the expectation that this part was longer. I don't know if I just it was something so like iconic that I remembered in detail, like, oh, he's fighting against the windmills because of like the imagery and things like that. But I didn't realize that it was so like such a short section of the chapter. But I think what's interesting for me specifically with this, I think was that like it's clear Don Quixote sees the windmills. There's now this justification of his actions, of he's going to attack it. Um, but I think what was interesting is that Sancho is very clear that they are windmills, right?
Yeah,
Which I don't remember being such a distinct thing. Um, where it becomes a thing of like Sancho is clear about what he sees, but he doesn't stop Don Quixote from acting, right?
yeah,
So I think it's interesting, like you say, in that he follows and buys into what Don Quixote is teaching him about, like because Don Quixote will say, like, I know everything you need to know about like being a knight and things like that. And when questioned, he'll say, like, you don't know those things, right?
yeah,
But he is clear in terms of like um those are windmills, that's what he sees, and he then reacts and engages with Don Quixote, which I think for me was quite interesting because I think that this chapter has two stages. This first stage is the idea of Sancho accepting Don Quixote's behaviors, and in a way then, like, I think in the second stage it also becomes clear that Don Quixote is accepting of Sancho in a way because of him being there. So I think it's quite interesting. I don't know, yeah, but I
yeah,
think I think it's interesting to also just like the justification that's also present in that Sancho is okay with Don Quixote's actions, provided he understands, like how they're relevant to him. He
yeah.
doesn't need them to see the giants. You know what I mean? So I think that was interesting in this first part, at least.
Yeah, it is also
Yeah,
interesting because there's a way you could read it almost as though poor Sancho is being indoctrinated, right? So
yeah,
he's being told by a figure that he respects, right? The
mm,
power of this kind of authority that he respects, that what his senses tell him is not true.
mm,
And in the sense you see Sancho as kind of like a poor victim of Don Quixote's madness. That is an interesting angle that's implied a little bit in what you say. But I also think it's your division of the parts is pretty insightful because, of course, these two, the juxtaposition of these two is clearly very deliberate because they're almost the same event.
yeah,
The clear distinction is that in the first instance, Sancho kind of accepts Don Quixote's behaviors for what they are and acts almost as like a neutral observer. In the second instance, he actually participates
mm,
in the outcome
mm,
Don Quixote's madness. So there's this sense in which you can't once you buy into certain. It's almost like once you buy into certain. Uh, Once you concede certain points, it's very difficult not to keep losing ground. And once you concede the point that, okay, look, I know these are windmills, but he says they're giants and that they were giants. So,
mm,
who's to say
mm,
is that's pretty
mm,
interesting.
mm,
There's this obvious continuous theme throughout this that's manifested by many distinct instances of Sancho being sensible, Sancho representing the senses, and Don Quixote perhaps representing the mind, right? Uh, and many have seen into this kind of an Aristotelian versus a Platonic philosophical outlook. It's interesting, of course, that Sancho relies on his sense of sight
mm,
in this instance. Later, as you've pointed out, he eats. He says
mm.
that he will say when he feels pain, and
Pain, yeah.
then also he drinks too much.
Yes.
It's pretty interesting that we do see. that we actually do see this. We see this kind of empiricism of Sancho. But what's also pretty interesting now that I think of it is that it's the hard facts of reality, the pain, the clashing against the windmill that seems to quote unquote bring Don Quixote to his right senses afterwards, right? So he believes that this is a windmill up until he believes this is a giant up until he hits the windmill.
Mm,
Um, and of course, yeah, we'll get there. Well, maybe we'll jump ahead to there right now because I think maybe what we would say is that that point that you made earlier, where he collides with the windmill. There's this interesting thing about the wind blowing at the right time, and I'd
yeah.
like to return to that in a moment because I think it's making reference to previous literature. But after he collides with the windmill, then he says, "Oh, now they're windmills."
Yes.
So the point there, the instance there is that his senses seem to be actually functioning. Is the
Mm,
madness of Don Quixote, if he is mad, because of course there is this whole debate, like, is Don Quixote mad or not? Um, if he is mad, then his madness must then lie in some sort of cognitive processing of images that are clearly perceived, right? He clearly and distinctly perceives these as windmills, it would see. His eyes are functioning, let's put it that way. His eyes are clearly functioning, but there's kind of like this disjuncture between what his senses tell him and what he conceives, right?
mm.
I think that's pretty interesting, and maybe you would know a little bit more with your research on cognition and psychology and the relation with technology there. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, any comments there?
I think what's interesting with that is that for me, I think the approach is firstly because we're not certain even before of if Don Quixote is mad or he's not mad. But what we do have a perception of, right? It's his ability to switch between states. So I
Yeah,
think it's interesting that you say once there's the physical reaction, then he is saying, okay, like that is a windmill. And then afterwards, he's cognitively having a explanation of why the giants have now become windmills is because there's the magician, right? Who
yeah,
transformed them. Frenton.
yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah.
Tristan, yeah. It ends in ton.
Yes, as the
Yeah.
as the niece or the
Uh,
the relative, the
yes,
house lady,
yes.
the landlady says, yeah, it ends in don.
It ends in ton.
Um,
But I think so with Sancho, it's the expectation of when will Sancho realize how Don Quixote is, right? And I think that's what we see in the first part of him seeing Don Quixote not listening, of engaging and attacking. But then afterwards, he sees, okay, Don Quixote like rationalizing about like, okay, they were transformed and things like that. And he sort of accepts that. And I think what's interesting there is there's the thing of afterwards, um, it's the idea of like complaining about pain. And then for Sancho, it's saying, like you say, it's interesting because you brought up the notion of like the body and like the mind. Um, so for Sancho, he's saying, when I feel pain, I vocalize it, right? So it's saying like this is how I am, and he's saying unless like in night stories, I don't have to be this way, like I can't
mhm.
vocalize it. And then Don Quixote will say, no, of course you can be like that because there's never stories of like the squire of the knight errant having to behave in a certain way. So I think there's uh, the relationship between the two, where the initial expectation is that Sancho will see that Don Quixote is behaving madly. It doesn't matter because, in a way, he is sustained in a way through his senses of he
Mhm.
is accepted to vocalize if he's feeling pain. He is accepted then to eat when he is hungry and to drink and things like that because of how Don Quixote allows him to function, within the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that ties into this very interesting thing where Don Quixote's whole way of life is sort of reconstructed from what is pretty much often derivative literature, right? So I've got this thing I call sometimes the 400-year rule. And maybe it's a little bit erroneous, but I think it's by and large a pretty good rule of thumb, which is that if something is still being read after 400 years, it's a pretty good sign that you should probably give some time to reading it because very clearly it's touching upon themes and things that are so profound that they're universal. And so almost wherever you are, whatever culture you come from, whatever your language might be, there's something in there perennial that you can benefit from. And it's pretty interesting that a lot of the books that Don Quixote is reading are not we don't read them. And in fact, a lot of them are only interesting because of Don Quixote itself. So there's this weird sense in which, like, and it's something I only thought about maybe right now, is that Don Quixote is entirely, his outlook on the world is entirely dictated by works that maybe haven't even stood the test of time. That's one interesting thing. The second interesting point is, you know, he's got this. It comes across as kind of arbitrary. Something is a good way of life or a bad way of life, depending on whether you can actually see it in the books. There's no attempt for him to kind of identify and abstract the principles behind what determines is good and bad in the chivalric romances and construct like a theory of what might be good and bad in the world of contingency in which we live, right? Because naturally he's going to come across so many instances that aren't in the Sergas de Esplandian or the Adventures of Amadis de
Mhm.
Gaula, that he won't have any means to construct almost like yeah, think they sometimes call it a deontology or something like an idea of what he should do in this kind of instance. Now, I think that that's possibly not unrelated to the fact that this book is coming out just 100 years after, a whole question of deriving your ethics and your morality from a set of texts becomes a serious problem in European Christendom at the time, right? Because you've got an idea of sola scriptura that arises as a consequence of the Reformation in the north of Europe, and 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 it seems as though there might be some, now, I wouldn't say it's necessarily conscious on Cervantes's part, but the whole problem of how you derive what you believe is good and bad from a set of texts that don't have one explicit, clear, obvious means of interpretation or mode of interpretation seems pretty relevant for the time that this was written in, and I suppose even relevant for us today, right? So yeah, that's a pretty long kind of abstract point, but it was touching quite closely on what you were saying about Sancho is now like almost depending on Don Quixote to tell him, based on text that Sancho's never read himself, what's good
Mm,
and what's bad, right?
mm. And I think there's also like a negotiation around that as well, because when they speak um, later on about this idea of defending yourself when you're attacked, like Sancho is like very clear in that, like, oh, if somebody's going to attack me, like I'm not going to respect this rule you just told me, right? Because I think he's, in a way, he's more practical, but it's interesting that what you were touching on now. In a way, Sancho is more practical, but in his practicality, he can question the underlying theories present,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is this idea of like you say, like a just war, things like that, where you're defending yourself, where there's a situation where we can understand the principles and then align it. Where with Don Quixote, it's very much, if is this present in any of the chivalric romances, and if it's not present, then it's okay, it doesn't matter, right? So I don't need to understand the theory because I'm just going to follow what I see,
Hmm.
you know,
Interesting.
what I've read. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There is the sense in which Don Quixote isn't being entirely theoretical either, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's actually not such a huge difference between him and Sancho.
Yeah.
I like this whole part about where the of course when Don Quixote thinks that these are giants, and then he comes to conclude that they are not. That's this whole symbiosis, this dichotomy that's within throughout Don Quixote, but is I mean it's a tendency, it's an ongoing trend in the literature of the period in
Mm.
Spain, and that's engaño and desengaño, deceit, and then kind of falling away from deceit, having the scales removed from your eyes, desengaño. Um, so that's I mean maybe that's also why this particular scene has become so iconic because it does encapsulate this whole theory or dynamic that's present in much of the literature of the period.
Mm.
Some of my other notes here that I'll introduce, unless you've got something else that you want to say on your side, is I just wanted to comment on how humorous I find Sancho's sarcasm, or actually not his sarcasm, but just how plainly he says and what he sees. I mean, you've got this opening line where Don Quixote is like loquacious as he ever is, and he talks all about how he will wage battle against these giants, and he makes all these mythological allegories, and then Sancho's response is two words: "Que gigantes." What giants, and I think I found Sancho. I've always liked Sancho Panza, but I find him very his simplicity is very endearing. And he actually makes there's a part in which after as they're traveling between this incident with the windmills and then they move to the part with the caravan. It's not really a caravan, but the carriage where he sort of just thinks to himself, he's eating, right? And he's eating very deliberately and he's making a good deal being very conscious as he's eating and enjoying what he's eating. And it says there that he just thinks of it as an adventure. He considers it an adventure,
Yes.
which I really like because it's very, I don't know, it's quite sweet actually, in a way that Sancho's got this, he's got this very simple but quite I think wholesome way of seeing life.
I think what's very interesting as well is, and I'm not sure exactly because I read the English, but they say he doesn't even think about the island that he was promised, right?
Yes, yes,
So in a sense, what's interesting with Sancho is he communicates very directly of like it's quite good. He's sort of enjoying the experience, and he can just communicate directly with Don Quixote and say he doesn't see that. Or I think later on, he also says a line around if it's going to be like again like the windmills when he attacks the when Don Quixote is attacking the friars, you know. So he sees the same situation, but he's enjoying like the experience of it. But he is not motivated by some end goal, you know.
yeah,
He's just there for the adventure, which I think is something that I miss. Like I had a misconception of when like we get introduced to his character of his motivation, you know.
yeah, yeah. He
Yeah.
makes me think quite a lot of Sam in The Lord of the Rings, in fact,
Yeah.
and yeah, very very endearing character in this particular section. Now, unless you've got any points there, I think I'd like to move on to the second part. So, as you said, they decide that Don Quixote decides that further adventures await them
Mm.
in. I'm looking for the place exactly that he mentions.
Puerto Lápiz.
Uh, Excellent. Yeah, Puerto Lápiz. So
Yeah.
he says that more adventures will meet them. And then, of course, they come down across the road. They come across this traveling group, right? The friars and the lady who is going to see her husband in Seville.
Mm.
And Don Quixote sees this, of course, as a lady is being captured by these rogues. Um, Sancho protests, saying like, "Don't get involved with this. These are actually friars." And but of course he isn't able to do anything. But as we mentioned before, that doesn't stop him from taking advantage of one of the friars that's been knocked down. It's interesting, of course, that here Don Quixote starts fighting with his new lance. And there are two kind of interesting symbolic moments here. The whole symbolism of his lance being broken. Of course, in these stories, and we see it even in like in a lot of modern series, right? When a character's weapon is destroyed, that's kind of that's quite a it's almost like a part of their soul is destroyed in the story, right? And they always go on kind of like a journey to discover who they truly are in order to gain a new weapon. That's pretty interesting that that happens because that's very clearly prefigured in a lot of the chivalric romance corpus. And then this whole thing of the wind blowing. It's almost like an intervention of God, right? In a lot of those stories would be kind of like well, God would sometimes intervene in some of these previous stories that Don Quixote is inspired by. I'm maybe moving slightly off of my point here, but of course it is just interesting that Don Quixote is not fighting with his normal lance, and that's why the Basque traveler can defend himself with a pillow, which I always
Mm,
found like a relatively humorous
mm,
part where everyone else is sort of stuck watching one man try beat another with a stick attached to parts of a broken lance,
mm.
and the guy defend himself with a pillow. Any comments on this section from you?
I think what's interesting for me, particularly in this section, was that through Don Quixote's commitment to accepting the situation of the this princess that is being taken away, the guy he ends up fighting who has to use a pillow and then they're fighting by swords, they end up like antagonizing one another, you know? So the people around, I think it's even said like they everyone around was just watching as if they were fighting as if they were like mortal enemies. Like they had been set to fight this battle for a long time. And I think it's interesting with the notion of you saying as well that he has this broken lance, and because then there's this build-up of, oh, there's a hero who broke their weapon and now they're meeting their ultimate enemy and they're going to settle this big dispute that they have. um, I think what's interesting to me is that in this we see how already Don Quixote, before, I never perceived him as a threat to people.
Hmm.
But in this specific scenario, when Don Quixote wasn't fighting in the previous situations, they beat him up. He wasn't a threat to anyone. But in this specific situation, it said that he would have killed the friar if he hadn't jumped off his horse. And it said that also he's now using his sword to cut the the servant of the lady who's traveling. And if he didn't have the pillow there, he would have been cut, like already in half. He would have been hurt, you know. So I think Don Quixote's actions now, even though he's acting from a place of belief, of imagination, is becoming very real. And I
Yeah.
think we spoke about that in the previous chapter as well, where if someone is strongly held within their beliefs and in their imagination, they can end up creating their fictionalized world into a reality, which we see later on. But I
Yeah.
think it's something that it becomes also clear in the way that Sancho behaves, in that even though he does not necessarily, I don't think it's clear that he necessarily believes all these things. He still sees the friar, but he is able to believe that this is a spoil of war, that he has been knocked down by my master, and I can go and like collect my rewards, you know, and then like stripping the friar before he gets attacked. So I think it's interesting just to see that Don Quixote's actions, governed by his beliefs, will have such a big impact on the surrounding people.
Yeah.
Um, be it life threatening, later on being that he saves some situation, I think stood out for me. Yeah,
Yes, yes, and you are quite right in the sense that every single time that we see Don Quixote now interacting the with the rest of the world, it's more and more people who are being affected in a more and more profound way. It starts out with the boy, I think his name was Sebastian, I can't remember, but the boy who's being flogged, who may
yeah,
very well have actually stolen the sheep, right?
yes,
Um, and then of course you have after that instance the part of the crossroads where Don Quixote is beaten up again, and there are multiple people involved in that second scenario. And then, as you say here, he's actually threatening someone's life. Um, the person he's threatening, of course, is an unnamed Basque man who. It's interesting that Cervantes puts this in because it's pretty clear that Cervantes is kind of I don't know, maybe providing almost like a guide to all of Spain as it would have existed at the time, because we see characters present from all the different parts of Spain throughout this work. And of course, this man represents the Basque country. But what's pretty weird about this is that it's pretty much said here that he speaks Castilian no better than he speaks Basque. So,
mm.
like, the indication is that he doesn't even speak Basque particularly well, and I'm not really sure what to make of that. But of course, part of the humor is that he's you've got this like overly loquacious and florid language from Don Quixote, and then this like barely coherent Castilian from his adversary, and then we have this really surprising moment where it finishes with Don Quixote about to try and land a finishing blow on the poor Basque, who is I can't remember if he's named. Maybe I'm a bit ignorant there, but I don't remember him being named.
I don't believe he's named. I think it's just referred to as the Biscayan.
Yeah, the Vizcaíno in the El Vizcaíno in the
Yeah,
Castilian that I have access to, and I think the Vizcaíno in a lot of English translations. Um, yeah, so this of course final part is one of the most enigmatic, and we should probably preserve a lot of the discussion for the next chapter because there is so much to discuss about Cervantes' really clever diegetic layering here. What I will comment on before handing over to you is that this actually wasn't a technique that was entirely unknown at the time. The cliffhanger was the way that a lot of authors, even in the 1400s, would end chapters of their chivalric romances with in order to get the readers to read the next chapter or the next part. Cervantes does something different with that, and he makes this quite profound commentary on the reliability of narrative as such, and also the fluid boundaries between genres in general. But we'll probably cover that more next time. Any comments on your side about this ending part?
I think there's an interesting thing of this is the first situation where we see Don Quixote now actually in a fight, possibly going to end someone's life, and then it cuts, right? So it's a situation where we're finally seeing Don Quixote because there's the build-up of there's this crazy man, he tries to behave in ways like a knight, but is failing constantly. But to the point where now his actions, he could in his reality save this princess, right? So we're seeing the possibility of Don Quixote actually achieving the goals that he's setting out to achieve, and then it ends,
Yeah,
right? I think it's very purposeful in that it ends because there's a shift then of him being in control of the narrative he's going to set out to accomplish later on, you know. So it ends abruptly, and then there's this idea of who actually knows what happened, and we need to find help from the second author to retell the history. But there's the reason it ends for me, in my understanding, is that they're trying to give a break of this is the moment where Don Quixote finally can live into the realities he's set out to achieve.
Hmm.
And it ends because it's similar to what we said in the previous chapters of if the books weren't burned, he would have stayed at home. In this situation, if Don Quixote gets beaten up or killed, he wouldn't set out to do anything else afterwards.
Yeah,
So I think,
interesting. Yeah, and I've never, the funny thing is I've never thought of it in this sense that this is an instance where Don Quixote is kind of almost taking the reins of fortune and fate in his own hands and trying to actually make of himself someone. There's kind of like a comeback story element to a lot of this,
mm,
right? Where he's experienced that failure early on and he's pretty determined not to have it repeat. And so we see a much more determined, much more literally violent Don Quixote than we had previously. That's a very good point that I actually hadn't conceived of yet.
and I think that that's why it's the perfect moment then to not have that answer, right?
Yeah.
And that's why it's the cliffhanger.
Yeah, it is interesting that in the earliest editions of Don Quixote, today, as we know, we divide Don Quixote between part one and part two, but in the earliest editions, there were multiple parts of part one, and this is actually the end of part one.
Mm,
So yeah, so it's the perfect division to convey a very particular point about Don Quixote and his and how he's now changing according to how he's changing in order to try and fulfill his dream.
mm.
Now, unless there's anything more from your side, I think what we will do is we'll bring this discussion to a close for now. I'll say thank you to everyone who's watched this far. Uh, Keep your fingers crossed and wait for our next episode, which will be covering possibly the most diegetically interesting section of the whole book, chapter 9 of Don Quixote. So we can't wait to see you then. And from Tira and from me, we will say adios.